Smoky Hills, Kansas, September 1892. The prairie grass was cured to the color of old brass, and the wind, that constant, invisible river, carried the first hint of a chill that promised worse to come. On a small homestead carved out of the vast emptiness, Ferenc Barta was doing something no one had ever seen before. He wasn't chinking his log cabin with the usual mix of mud and grass. He was coating it entirely. With a wide, rough trowel, he slathered a thick, dark gray plaster over the seasoned cottonwood logs. The mixture wasn't smooth. It was fibrous, lumpy, clinging to the wood in a heavy 3-inch thick shell. From a distance, it looked like he was burying his own home in mud. Harlan Jessup, a rancher whose land bordered Barta's, reined in his horse, his face a mask of disbelief. And he ran 1,000 head of cattle and knew the ways of the plains. He knew what worked and what rotted. He watched Barta scoop another trowelful from a wooden trough where a strange concoction of clay, sand, and what looked like animal hair steamed faintly in the cool air. "Barta!" Jessup called out, his voice carrying easily on the wind. "What in God's name are you doing to that cabin?" Ferenc looked up, his face smudged with clay. He was a quiet man, his English still thick with the rhythms of his native Hungary. "Sealing it," he said, and went back to his work. Jessup dismounted and walked closer, joined by a neighboring farmer, Silas Croft, who'd been drawn by the strange sight. "You're going to rot your logs straight through," Jessup stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "Trapping damp in there's the surest way to lose a house. Every man on this prairie knows you let the logs breathe." He kicked at a hardened patch near the foundation. "This is foolishness." Silas Croft nodded, chewing on a piece of straw. "Looks like something from the old country, Harlan. Peasant work, not fit for Kansas." The word hung in the air, peasant. It was a judgment on the method and the man. Ferenc didn't flinch. He just pressed another layer of the fibrous clay into a gap, his movements methodical, unhurried. The community had already marked him as the Hungarian madman, the one who was building his own tomb before the first snow. What did this Hungarian stove builder, this Kalihas, understand about the physics of convection that these seasoned, expert Kansas ranchers and farmers had missed? The answer to that question would change how people survived on the American plains. But first, it would have to endure the mockery, the doubt, and the full, unrestrained fury of a Kansas blizzard. If you stay with me, I promise you will learn the fundamental principle of heat loss that builders still fight today. A principle this quiet immigrant mastered with nothing more than clay, water, and the hair from a horse's back. Let me know in the comments below. What's the strangest, yet most effective, home repair solution you've ever seen? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of forgotten frontier genius. Ferenc Barta was not a carpenter. He was not a farmer. And he was certainly not a frontiersman in the way his neighbors understood the term. Back in Hungary, he was a Kalihas. His world was one of fire clay, not prairie sod. His hands knew the heft of glazed ceramic tiles, the precise curve of a smoke channel, and the gritty, binding strength of horsehair mixed into mortar to seal a firebox against 1,000 heat cycles. He built massive, intricate masonry stoves, Kaliha, stoves that would take a single load of wood and radiate gentle, even heat for an entire day. The secret was not in the fire, but in the vessel. A Kaliha was a sealed system. Heat stayed in because nothing could get out. He and his wife Ilona had brought their 2 children, Miklos and Zofia, to America for the promise of land. They had arrived in the Smoky Hills with enough money to buy their plot and build a cabin, a standard cottonwood structure, just as the land agent advised. They had spent their first winter of 1891 in that cabin, and it had nearly broken them. And that first winter was a lesson in wind. The wind on the Hungarian plain was a familiar foe, but the Kansas wind was a different beast. It was a physical presence, a relentless pressure that found every microscopic crack in the chinking between the logs. Ferenc had used the best mixture he was told to use: clay, sand, and prairie grass. It dried and cracked within weeks. He patched it, and it cracked again. The cold didn't seep into the house. It flowed. He remembered watching Ilona try to light the candles on their small table. The flames wouldn't burn straight up. They bent sideways, flickering violently, sometimes nearly horizontal, pushed over by the drafts pouring through the walls. They were living inside a sieve. They burned through their entire woodpile by January, and Ferenc spent freezing days gathering whatever combustible material he could find. The children slept in their coats, huddled together. Ilona's face, usually so full of life, grew thin and pale. They survived, but Ferenc swore they would never live through a winter like that again. The problem wasn't the cold. The problem was the air. His neighbors faced the same struggle. It was the accepted reality of the plains. You built a big fire and you huddled close to it. You stuffed rags in the worst of the cracks, and you endured. Harlan Jessup, for all his confidence, burned through 4 cords of wood in his much larger ranch house, his family abandoning the northern rooms of the house entirely from December to March. The Miller family, 2 miles down the creek, lost their infant daughter to a lung fever that winter, a tragedy whispered about with a grim and fatalistic acceptance. The conventional wisdom was that the log walls themselves were the primary barrier against the cold. The chinking was just a filler. As long as the logs were thick, you were safe. But Ferenc, the stove builder, knew this was wrong. A vessel with 100 tiny leaks is no vessel at all. The heat wasn't radiating through the wood. It was being physically carried out of the house on currents of moving air. The enemy wasn't the -20-degree temperature outside. The enemy was the draft, the constant, invisible thief. He had spent his life building perfectly sealed containers for heat. Now, he would live in one. That spring, as soon as the ground thawed, Ferenc began his preparations. He found a rich deposit of blue clay down by the creek bed. He spent weeks digging it out, carting it back to his homestead in a wheelbarrow. He tested its consistency, mixing it with sand and water, letting it dry in the sun. He kneaded it to shrink minimally and resist cracking. He knew the formula from his years as a Kalihas. The final crucial ingredient came from Harlan Jessup himself, though the rancher didn't know it. Ferenc paid Jessup's stable hand $1 to collect the clippings and combings from the ranch's horses. He amassed a huge pile of coarse animal hair. To his neighbors, it was just a pile of dusty, smelly refuse. To Ferenc, it was the fibrous skeleton that would give his clay shell its tensile strength, allowing it to cure into a monolithic, seamless coat. In late August, he began the work. He mixed the clay, sand, water, and horsehair in a large trough, turning it over and over with a spade until it was a homogeneous, sticky mass. Ilona and the children helped, their hands and feet caked in the mud. The process was slow, laborious. He applied it directly to the logs, forcing it into every crack and crevice, then building up the layer until it was a uniform 3 inches thick, covering every square inch of the exterior walls, right up to the roof line. Harlan Jessup made his critical pronouncements during this phase. "That mud will rot your logs, Barta," he said one afternoon, leaning against his fence. "Come spring, you'll be able to push a finger right through the wood." Ferenc paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a muddy wrist. "In my country," he said quietly, "we coat the firebox. The clay protects the tile from the fire. Here, the clay protects the wood from the air." He offered no further defense. He simply returned to his work. The social criticism was quieter, but more pervasive. Men would ride by and shake their heads. Women would whisper at the general store in town. The Barta cabin, once a symbol of frontier hope, was becoming an object of pity and ridicule. It was ugly. The dark gray clay, embedded with visible strands of horsehair, looked primitive, alien. It didn't look like a proper American home. It looked, as Silas Croft had said, like peasant work. Ference ignored it all. He was not building for his neighbor's approval. He was building for the still, straight flame of a candle. He finished the last wall in late September. The cabin looked like a giant, misshapen clay pot sitting on the prairie. He let it cure for 3 weeks under the autumn sun, the clay slowly lightening in color as the water evaporated, shrinking just enough to pull itself into an airtight sheath around the logs. By the first frost of October, the shell was as hard as brick. He could rap his knuckles on it and hear a dull, solid thud. There were no cracks. The house was sealed. To understand the genius of what Ference Barta had done, you have to understand the physics of how a house loses heat. On the windswept prairie, the primary culprit was not conduction through the logs or radiation through the windows. It was convection. Convection is heat transfer through the movement of fluids, in this case air. His neighbors' cabins were losing up to 40% of their precious heat simply through air infiltration. Imagine all the tiny, invisible cracks in a standard log cabin, the gaps in the chinking, in the spaces around the window frames, the crack under the door. If you added up the area of all those little openings, you would find a hole in the wall 1 or 2 square feet in size. On a calm day, this is a problem. On a windy day, it's a catastrophe. The relentless Kansas wind creates a pressure differential. It pushes on the upwind side of the house, forcing cold, dense outside air through every crack it can find. This invading cold air physically shoves the warm, buoyant, interior air out through the cracks on the downwind side. A constant river of cold air flows through the house, stealing the heat a family works so desperately to create. A stove burning a cord of wood is fighting a losing battle if the fruits of its labor are being carried away on a current. This is why the candles in the Barta's cabin bent sideways. They were weather vanes, revealing the invisible currents of air that were robbing them of heat and life. Ference's 3-inch shell of horsehair-reinforced clay was, in modern terms, a near-perfect air barrier. It completely eliminated that convective heat loss. The horsehair acted like rebar in concrete, preventing the clay from cracking as it cured and settled. It created a monolithic, seamless membrane that the wind simply could not penetrate. There were no cracks for the air to flow through. The R value, the measure of thermal resistance of 3 inches of dried clay, is not particularly high. It's certainly less than the thick cottonwood logs it covered, but that didn't matter. The logs could now do their job properly. Without the constant assault of cold air infiltration, now the heat generated by the stove stayed inside the thermal envelope of the house. The logs and the air within the cabin became a stable thermal mass, absorbing and radiating heat slowly and evenly. Ference hadn't just added a layer of insulation. He had fundamentally changed the physics of his home. He had turned a sieve into a bell jar. The mockery of his neighbors was rooted in a complete misunderstanding of the problem. They were trying to insulate against the cold. Ference was building a wall against the wind. The first snows came in November, light and dry. The Barta cabin was noticeably warmer, the stove consuming half the wood it had the previous year. But the real test arrived in the second week of January. The sky turned a metallic gray, the temperature plummeted, and the wind began to howl from the north. A plains blizzard. For 4 days, the world disappeared into a churning vortex of white. The wind was a physical force, hitting the walls of the cabins with the force of a battering ram. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero, with a wind chill that the old-timers would later claim was 70 below. Drifts piled up against barns and houses, burying fences and reaching the roof lines. It was a storm that would be spoken of for decades. Inside Harlan Jessup's ranch house, it was a battle for survival. Despite having 2 stoves roaring, the main room struggled to stay above 45 degrees. Frost coated the interior of the north-facing walls. The family lived in a small huddle of blankets, leaving the fires only when absolutely necessary. Jessup himself barely slept, constantly feeding the stoves, his mind filled with the dread of a chimney fire or running out of wood. He thought of Ferenc Barta's mud hut and shuddered, picturing the family frozen inside. 2 miles away inside the clay-coated cabin, a different reality unfolded. The roar of the wind was a distant, muffled sound, like a storm heard from deep within a cave. There were no drafts, none. The air inside was so still it felt thick. The small cast-iron stove glowed with a low, steady fire, consuming wood at a placid, almost lazy pace. The interior temperature held at a comfortable 68 degrees. Ilona kept a pot of rich, paprika-scented goulash simmering on the stove, filling the small cabin with the smell of home and hot food. Zsofia, her 6-year-old daughter, sat on the floor, far from the stove, drawing pictures on a small slate. Miklos, 9. He was quietly carving a piece of wood into the shape of a horse. These small acts of domestic peace were the true measure of Ferenc's success. They were activities impossible for a child who was shivering, whose hands were numb with cold. Ferenc Barta sat at the table, reading a worn Hungarian Bible by the light of a single tallow candle. The flame was a perfect, unwavering spear of yellow light, absolutely still. When the storm finally broke on the 5th day, the sun rose on a world transformed, a landscape of sculpted white drifts under a painfully blue sky. Harlan Jessup's first instinct was concern. He was a hard man, but a decent one. He worried for his neighbors, especially the strange Hungarian. He saddled his horse and gathered 2 of his ranch hands, Silas Croft among them. "We're checking on the Bartas," he announced. "Bring shovels. They're likely drifted in, or worse." They rode through the deep snow, their horses struggling. When they came over the rise that overlooked Barta's homestead, they stopped. The cabin was almost completely buried, a low mound in the snow with a roof. But from the stone chimney, a thin, lazy curl of gray smoke rose into the frigid air. The house was alive. They dismounted and waded through the waist-deep snow to the door. Jessup knocked, his heavy glove making a dull thud. After a moment, the door opened. Ferenc Barta stood there, dressed in a simple shirt and trousers. He wasn't haggard or exhausted. He looked rested, calm. Behind him, Jessup could see Ilona clearing away breakfast dishes. He could feel a wave of impossible warmth billowing out into the frozen air. "Barta," Jessup said, his voice hoarse. "Bok, are you all right?" "We are well," Ferenc replied simply. "God is good. Come in, out of the cold." Jessup and Silas stepped inside, and the world changed. The howling wind was gone, replaced by a profound, tomb-like silence. The air was warm, not hot and dry like the air near a roaring stove, but a gentle, uniform warmth that filled the entire space. Jessup took off his gloves. His eyes scanned the cabin, trying to understand what he was seeing. The children were playing quietly on the floor. There were no piles of blankets. There was no frost on the walls. His gaze then fell upon the woodpile next to the stove. It was nearly full. Barta had used less wood in 4 days of a blizzard than Jessup had used in a single night. Then, Jessup saw it. On the table, next to Ferenc's Bible, was the candle. Well, its flame burned straight and tall, a perfect, undisturbed teardrop of light. It did not flicker. It did not bend. It was utterly completely still. That was the proof. That was the moment the rancher's rigid certainty shattered. He understood. The wind hadn't been stopped at the chinking. It had been stopped 3 inches outside the logs. He reached out and placed his bare palm against the interior log wall. He expected to feel the biting cold of the wood, the telltale sign of a house losing its heat to the outside. Instead, the wood was just cool, neutral. It wasn't stealing warmth from his hand. Jessup looked at the rough, seamless interior walls, then at Ferenc. The mockery, the confident pronouncements, the dismissal of peasant work. It all felt like the babbling of a fool. He had been so wrong. He finally looked Barta in the eye, a deep, earned respect dawning on his face. He shook his head slowly, a sense of awe in his voice. "My God, Barta," Jessup said, his voice low, "you didn't plaster a cabin. You built a lung that holds its breath." That spring, Harlan Jessup was Ferenc Barta's first and most fervent convert. He paid Ferenc to supervise the coating of his own large ranch house and another for his head foreman. The talk of peasant work vanished, replaced by grudging admiration and then outright imitation. But the idea's true dissemination came from an unlikely source, a traveling circuit preacher. Reverend Miles was a thin, wiry man who covered 3 counties in the Smoky Hills region, preaching in barns, schoolhouses, and homesteads. But he'd nearly frozen to death in his own small parsonage during the Great Blizzard, and was captivated by the story of the Hungarian's warm cabin. He visited the Barta homestead in April, felt the lingering quiet and solidity of the place, and listened as Ferenc, in his simple, direct way, explained the principle of the sealed vessel. Reverend Miles saw it not just as a building technique, but as a parable, a lesson in humility, in the wisdom of the outsider, in the triumph of quiet competence over loud foolishness. He began to speak of it in his sermons and in the conversations he had after services. He didn't just describe the technique, he described the proof. "I saw it with my own eyes," he would tell a congregation in a drafty barn. "In a cabin caked in mud, a candle flame that does not move. A family that survived the great storm, not with a bigger fire, but with a better house." The story spread like wildfire on the dry prairie. Farmers and ranchers, who respected the Reverend's word and their own bitter experience with winter, began to experiment. The Barta shell, as it came to be known, started appearing on cabins across the region. By the fall of 1893, more than 30 families had coated their homes. The next winter was a mild one, but the results were undeniable. Families reported cutting their wood consumption by half, some by as much as 2/3. The technique saved not just labor and resources, but lives. The Smoky Hills, once a place of brutal winter endurance, became a region known for its warm, efficient homes. The quiet Hungarian stove builder had, without seeking fame or fortune, he revolutionized frontier architecture. He had taken a principle from an ancient European craft and applied it to a new and hostile environment. He had looked at a log cabin not as a wall, but as a container, and understood that a container that leaks is no container at all. What Ferenc Barta did with clay and horsehair in 1892 was a primitive but profoundly effective anticipation of modern building science. Today we call his invention an air barrier. We use sophisticated polymer membranes, spray foams, and acoustical sealants to achieve the same end. We perform blower door tests, depressurizing a house with a powerful fan to measure the exact rate of air leakage in cubic feet per minute. A modern high-performance house is built to be exceptionally airtight. Ferenc Barta built his airtight house with materials dug from the earth beneath his feet. He was a century ahead of his time, a quiet genius who understood a fundamental truth that the construction industry would take another 100 years to fully embrace. The most important layer of a wall is the one that stops the wind. There is a deep-seated instinct that a house must breathe. It's a comforting, organic metaphor, but it is a deadly one. The old frontier wisdom, born of drafty, leaky structures, mistook a flaw for a virtue. The houses of the prairie breathed, yes, they breathed in the Arctic wind and breathed out the precious, life-sustaining heat of the fire. Ferenc Barta, the outsider, the Kalihas, brought a different wisdom. It was the wisdom of the sealed vessel, the furnace, the kiln. A thing designed to hold heat cannot be porous. A house that cannot breathe out its warmth is a house that cannot freeze. He didn't just build a home, he redefined what a home was. Not a temporary shelter against the storm, but a calm, still place. A pocket of enduring warmth held safe against the endless, moving river of the wind. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of historical engineering and physics valuable, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more tales of forgotten innovators. We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. What other modern technologies do you see foreshadowed in historical practices? The content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes. It presents a fictionalized narrative inspired by real historical building techniques and scientific principles. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are products of creative reconstruction. Any application of historical building methods in a modern context should be undertaken with careful consideration of current building codes, safety standards, and professional engineering advice. This video does not constitute professional, technical, or legal guidance.